Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, this is my review of the film that has been long awaited by members of both fandoms, and that is Godzilla vs. Kong. Now before I delve into this film, I feel I have to give a little overview about my entry into both fandoms. Now I saw both Godzilla and Kong films pretty young. Godzilla, I don't directly remember when I was first introduced to. I know it had to do with a lot of the showings on TV in the 90s, on TNT, TBS, A&E, other ones, and a few rentals. Now, of course, because of that, I saw the films out of order, and this was before I knew that at that point there were two series. By the time I reached adolescence, we had a third one with the Millennium series, but I would watch a lot of them, and in fact, I actually do have the rental copies of a few of the films, but they're out of my reach right now, but they're back here. I do have the rental copies, and I do still have a couple of the other films on home video. Even before the recent Criterion collection was released. See, here's a couple examples. I got a good deal on this, because this DVD, this is one of those ones that you can find a steal like I did for less than $5, but most of the time it's going to be like, yeah. You want an example? Look at the DVD price of Godzilla. No, it's Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. Look at the DVD price of that. It's like... Now for Kong, I was introduced to that at a young age, like less than 5, by my grandmother, the one that I live with. She always did show me some of the older films, and this was a film she saw when she was a kid, and she remembers that she cried from the ending, and I watched it and I enjoyed it. And of course I got it on DVD around here somewhere, and one of these days I'll get around to doing my review on it. But I can say with all honesty right now that it is, if it's not the first film that made me love cinema, it is the big one I saw early on that made me love cinema. Because after that, it'd be films like RoboCop, Total Recall that cemented it. But Kong would be the one that made me originally love it. Now, with that, when I found out through reading a certain monster book that there was a crossover at one point, you bet your butt I had to go watch it. Now, sadly, it took a while for me to track this down. This is not my original copy. I originally had the VHS. But when I came across the VHS at Walmart, I'm like, we have to get this. And I would watch it from time to time. I enjoyed it. Now, when I first saw the original film, I did not consciously note a lot of the stuff. I noted some of it, but I can say now as an adult that part of the reason I enjoy the film is because of its cheese factor. I mean, the Godzilla suit's alright, but you can notice that there are some downgrades from how they showed it in the first film, not accounting for the technology at the time. Some of it is like, okay, they probably could have worked a little bit better to make that not happen, like around the neckline. But with the Kong suit, you're like, oh, that's just bad. But I think it crosses into the so bad it's good category where you just go with it. And then, of course, some of the dubisms and some of the Americanizations that they did to localize the film in this version is like, wow. That's part of the reason why I enjoy it. But when I am in the mood to watch the film now, I usually just stick with the original version. I mean, both films are fun, if for no other reason besides the monster fight, for the fact that when it comes to the human characters, it is a satire of the Japanese television market at the time. If you want one moment that really sums that up, it's when the character of Taco, and no, that is not named after the Mexican dish, it's named after the Japanese word for octopus, is watching Godzilla on TV, and all of a sudden he's like, and what's he doing that for? Not because people are dying and Godzilla's rampaging, it's because Godzilla is taking all the ratings. And that's the reason he goes, I'm sick of Godzilla. As I got older, one thing I did kind of lament as I saw more and more Godzilla films, as I saw some of the other Kong films, was why did they ever do a remake? Then I found out years later that during the Heisei series, Toho did try to make a remake. But RKO, if I'm remembering my timeline right, who had the rights at the time, were like, nope, nope, nope. and they were charging too much money. They decided to try to use Mechanic-Kong from their King Kong Escapes film, but they wanted to charge a fee for that. So at the end of the day, they just said screw it. Now, it's one of those things that how this film would have played out. It would have been interesting to see. I mean, with how overpowered Godzilla was in the Heisei series, that Kong would probably have to get some power-ups of his own, like give him a laser ability or transport the electricity makes him stronger thing, and then he can actually shoot lightning from his hands, give the monkey unlimited power. Or, as another thing I've heard recently, is they were going to make him a cyborg Kong, to be able to fight him, which would make sense because they ended up making the remake of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah on the heels of this idea, so throwing the cyborg idea in there would make sense. Then, of course, they were originally going to make a sequel to this film, which the main thing I've heard about that in recent years is that would have confirmed that the ending of this fight, this guy killed this guy. And now he's made a monkey out of him, to use the old Simpsons line. Now, step further, when Legendary started doing their MonsterVerse, first thing I was thinking, like, okay, let's just see how this first Godzilla film goes. But in the back of my head, I was wondering, like, if they could play their cards right and get a hold of King Kong as well, it'd be nice to see them do it. And when I heard that they were doing Kong Skull Island, I'm like, oh yeah, they're going to do it. And then when I saw that ending in there, I'm like, oh yes, they're doing it. So as time's gone on and they released King of the Monsters and the years have gone on since those films, I've been thinking like, oh, I can't wait for it. And then of course COVID hit and we had to get this film delayed by a year, but I can, with all honesty, if I could speak right, say that the wait was worth it because I really did enjoy this film. This is one of the films that they premiered on HBO Max that also went into theaters that I saw first on HBO Max. I enjoyed it, and I decided, what the heck, and I went and saw it in theaters. And I can say, it is a little different going from seeing the film for the first time here to seeing it on the big screen, but you get to appreciate some things a bit more. It's like how I've said with a lot of the films I've grown up on, when you go from watching it on this to watching it on the big screen, you notice some things you never noticed before. Like, let's see if it's back here. No, it's in the cover. Like when I saw Jurassic Park in theaters. I've seen it twice in theaters, by the way. Going from watching the VHS copy to watching it on the big screen, I'm like, this is a little different. I never noticed a lot of this stuff before. A lot of the details and the cinematography, the lighting, how the scenes were set. You notice the things. Here, I noticed, well, the first thing I definitely noticed was the change in the sound. You go from my setup right here, which is a normal setup on a Roku TV, to the theatrical setup, which I've only been to 2 other films since then, and I haven't seen a film in that theater since into last year when they were briefly reopened before closing again, and I don't think I was on that side of the theater in that room, so it definitely was a speaker volume I noticed. Special effects, they looked amazing on there. Now, like the previous film, Godzilla vs. Kong. I'm so used to saying it the way the original did it. Godzilla vs. Kong. Definitely takes a lot of notes from the Showa era. There's like a couple from the late Heisei era in there because it's treated a little bit more seriously like they were in the Heisei era, but its heart is definitely beating Showa. To that regard, it's one of those ones that you got to leave your brain a little bit at the door and enjoy the film for what it is. And if you're not fully engaged with the human plot elements, and there's too many humans, it's like, that's how a lot of these films are. If you don't like the human one, you just got to try to get through it to get to the monster action, or if you don't want to sit through the whole film, you could always Google and watch the monster action independently. Now, that being said, I actually did like the human characters in this film, at least the lead ones. I mean, here we got Alexander Skarsgård playing Dr. Lind. I thought he was a pretty good character, pretty decent. I mean, not the deepest character, but for this type of film, I thought he was serviceable. I believe Skarsgård's little summation is the best way to describe his character. He's a reluctant hero who's thrown into a dangerous situation, and he's definitely not equipped for it. That's pretty accurate, especially since he's approached by who turns out to be the villains. Which, by the way, I know somebody's going to say, oh, this is another example of the secret villain trope. It's like, nah, I was kind of calling it at the beginning, mainly because of the whole thing about Mechagodzilla, which, spoiler, he does actually appear in here, but you know with how they did that original trailer, they knew what they were doing. If they wanted to keep Mechagodzilla a surprise fully, they would have kept him as a surprise fully. But they threw in that little brief shot because they knew people would freeze frame and be like, oh, it's Mechagodzilla. The only thing they really kept a surprise was his design and how he actually is introduced into the film. Which the best way I can describe his introduction into the film is, imagine Kiru from those two films in the Millennium series, but if they made his reason for being darker, and he was a heel instead of a hero. So they flipped the roles here. Got Rebecca Hall as Dr. Andrews. She does a pretty good job of what she has to do. And good doctor role, and she has that maternal side with the girl, who is Kong's translator, essentially, which I'll get to that in a little bit. And she was in Frost next in Iron Man 3, Holmes and Watson. Millie Bobby Brown of Stranger Things fame as Madison Russell. She still does a pretty good job here. Now, her character has changed a little bit. It seems like she's trying to honor her mother, which I know some people are going to go like, oh yeah, honor her mother after what her mother did in the previous film. But work along the same line. Try to better it. Which I think they threw that in there mainly because of another character I'm going to be mentioning in a little bit. Try to show, okay, one went the right way, one went the wrong way. She is going a little bit into conspiracy theory territory with how she's viewing some of Godzilla's latest actions. But considering that this is 5 years after the previous film, and this is the first time Godzilla's doing something like this, it makes sense to a point. We got Julian Dennison, who you might remember from a certain Fox film involving a certain merc with a certain mouth, plays Josh, who is Madison's best friend. They kind of balance each other. It's the yin to yang, whereas Josh is all like, oh, I don't think we should be doing that. And Madison's like, we're going to do it. Dang it! They have a weird friendship, but you do believe it. And apparently, Julian did screen test with Miley beforehand. But the weird thing is that they screen tested using Romeo and Juliet scenes. I think they mainly did that to make sure they had a good chemistry together, which is understandable. I mean, whether you're playing against someone platonically or romantically in a film, you want to make sure there's some chemistry there, or else the audience is going to be like, I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. Here, I believe them as friends. Although it makes you wonder, how far after the previous film did these two meet? We got Brian Tyree Henry from Into the Spider-Verse and Joker playing the character Bernie, who is the hardcore conspiracy theorist, which I kind of get to a point considering everything that's gone on in this universe since the Titans have shown up. And of course, especially recently with Godzilla's behavioral change. But some of the stuff he spouts, I'm like, really? Like the whole tap thing, it's like, really? You're going into that whole nonsense about fluoride in the water. I bet you're going to next be saying that the work of Monarch and them is the thing that's actually turning the frogs gay. That's a thought. Of course, our real villain is Walter Simmons, played by Demián Bichir. He does a pretty good job of what little he has to do there. His character is part of the reason I say this film definitely would be at home in the Showa era with how everything's built in. Because how his character is, some depth, straddling the one-note line with his motivation, definitely feels like something that someone from the Showa film era would do. Although a lot of them, it was about greed, or once the aliens were brought in, taking over the world. It feels right there if you were to make it like, we gotta get rid of Godzilla, but it's for my own selfish reasons, instead of, we gotta get rid of Godzilla, he's gonna destroy the world with his atomic breath, like in the first one. Granted, it will not really destroy the world there, but it's a consequence of him coming ashore that he'll destroy the world. So not maliciously, but as a result of his actions. And of course, to get his ends, he's working with the son of Dr. Serizawa named Ren, played by Shun Oguri. Which is not really a lot said about this Serizawa, which, according to director Adam Wingard, was intentional. And part of that was they didn't have enough screen time to really introduce you to his motivations, which to a point makes sense, because with his father, from the first time we saw him to his sacrifice, we had about 2 films worth of material to get through. However, I counter that with, you could have had one brief scene at one point that would have summed up his whole motivation. Like, give him a couple lines to really state why he's on this side instead of following in his father's footsteps. And you could have got there, but nope, you leave it a mystery. Which it's a lost opportunity on one hand, but on another, it's like, alright, makes you wonder exactly why he's thinking differently than his father. I mean, Shun does what he can with the role, but there's not really a lot to do other than, oh, I'm Serizawa's son. Hi. I'm a bad guy here. Now, I mentioned the director, Adam Wingard. He does a pretty good job directing-wise. He gets good performances out of the cast. He sets up the shots pretty well. Dealing with the special effects, I think, nice little balance there. Which kind of makes sense because his previous 2 films did involve special effects. I mean, his film before this was the Death Note remake, which I have not watched. I haven't even read Death Note in depth, so I probably won't hate it as much as other people. Before that was Blair Witch, which I hear people really hate. I haven't even watched Book of Shadows, so that should tell you how much interest I have in watching the Blair Witch films outside the original. And then, of course, the film, just the title alone was meme-worthy for me. You're next! The film was written by Eric Pearson and Max Borenstein. Borenstein, he wrote the Godzilla reboot and also Skull Island, so bringing him on board makes sense. Get a little bit of continuity from the start. And Pearson, he wrote the film that hasn't come out yet, Black Widow. He also wrote Agent Carter, both the short film and 8 episodes. And apparently he did uncredited rewrites on Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. Makes me wonder what those rewrites were. Were they like last minute ones? Were they on set ones to change up some of the dialogue? Trying to change a couple plot points, add something? Something I gotta look into. Junkie XL did the music. It does a pretty good job. My only complaint with it is that they didn't figure out a way to somehow work the original theme in there, even if it's just a melody. It's like dun 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 dun. Now, part of the reason I say that is that we were a little spoiled with the previous film where we got variations of Mothra and Godzilla's original theme. Only thing there is we didn't get a variation of Rodan's theme, at least that I noticed. Like, you know, da na 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 da da na. That's more Ghidorah's theme, but it's usually sometimes played over Rodan in that film. That would have been nice, like even if it's like a metal version. Da da na da 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 na da 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 da. Heavy reverb. Da na 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 na. Would have been nice, like even if it's just the drums. Dun 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 dun. And then maybe bring in another type of maybe then bring in a guitar riff. Again, there's not really that many moments where you could have thrown it in other than maybe making it the overture for the credits at the beginning. Or like when it shows the title, could have put it in dun dun dun. They do a variation of Godzilla's theme at points, but it's more like just the opening part, like. Now I've been through all here, and I haven't really talked about the motivations of the monsters. Now Kong's motivation throughout the whole film is, of course, self-preservation. I mean, Godzilla's the one attacking him. He wants to do right by the human characters in there, especially the little girl who he has a friendship with, which I did briefly mention that she's his translator, and that's because she taught Kong sign language. Which I know some people are going to go, really? They taught the giant ape it? Which, if that's the case, it's going to be like, really? Your whole you're fine with the fact that there's a giant monkey about to fight a giant dinosaur, but you draw the line at said monkey learning sign language? Here's the thing. Real-life apes have been taught forms of sign language and other type of language. Look up Kanzi the bonobo if you don't believe me. He puts the pine needles in the refrigerator. So if real-life apes are able to be taught a form of it, then certainly a titan-sized ape with a vastly larger brain that seems to have a little bit more human characteristics than other type of apes should be able to be taught sign language and be able to comprehend what he's being taught. I mean, we even see Godzilla has some human-type traits in this one, which is a little different than some of the other ones, which, by example, show a connection there. So it would make sense there. Now Kong, like I said, wanting self-preservation. Godzilla, he's really in I'm the Alpha Titan mode after the previous film. Now, other than these two, we don't really see any giant titans. We see other things like skull crawlers. We see these weird little dragon things. And some other little things that are a bit bigger than humans, which I would call naked parrots with bat wings. But we don't really see any giant ones. No Rodan, no Mothra, none of the other ones that were introduced at the end, which makes you wonder, what are they doing? Are they off doing their own things while listening to Blue Oyster Cult covers? Because you would think during the whole thing, especially with Ghidorah coming back, that at least Rodan and Mothra would show up. But nope, not in the budget there. And it could also be that, I know they had to pay Toho a fee for them, so maybe it's per film. But they were able to work in Ghidorah's skull, which, by the way, that shows that that whole thing from the previous film is worked in here. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. Which, in the back of my mind when I saw that, I'm like, head. There's a couple ways they could be going. I was thinking they were going to try to make it into Mecha Ghidorah, but making it a Mecha Godzilla makes a little bit more sense. Hence the whole Kiru thing. Instead of being built on the skeleton of a previous Godzilla, it's built on the skull of King Ghidorah. Explains why he's a heel. Well, that's the reason why Godzilla is going after Kong. It makes sense. You know, he's still in alpha mode, doesn't want to deal with any other challenges. And that's the reason they fight. Now, I know some people are probably going to complain about that, but there's a line in the localization of this film that I feel sums it up. Being instinctive rivals, there's no doubt they will intend to destroy one another. And that sums up all three of their fights. Now, their first fight, a little unfair because Godzilla attacks Kong out at sea, so obviously he has the direct advantage because they're at sea. And since their fights are kind of built like how a pro wrestling match would be, which, little hint about another video I have planned one of these days. Say no more. That whole thing, a cornet line came into mind while I was watching the theater. It's like, just don't book the match. Which is true. I mean, if you don't want the unfair advantage or you don't want people complaining about it unfair, then just don't book it. But here, it's nice, especially because in this film, we never got to see them fight at sea other than the ending, where we don't actually see the fight. And of course here, like, monkey's got to play dead. Second fight, a bit more fair. They're fighting on even grounds. Kong has his weapon, which he doesn't make it, but he finds it. And the axe blade can reflect the atomic breath, which makes sense that Kong will get a weapon like that. Because I would say if there's one thing that I'm like noticed a lot about Godzilla's end, is that he was spamming his atomic breath even more so than I can remember previously. I mean, there were a couple moments in this film where he spammed it, but of course this was when it was actually breath, not like a beam or like how it is in this series where it's a balance of beam and breath. It's like a wavy beam. But it would be like a couple ones and then Kong would run through and then they'd start fighting again. Even in some of the other films, I can't remember him spamming it. Maybe it's because of how quickly he used it, and I'm like, he's using it like one in a video game would do it. Like, it's like you're playing as a character in a game and you're like, yeah, you frickin' beam spammer, fight fair. And of course, because of that, Kong has to use his agility. He's got to run around the buildings. He's got to jump off the ship. Got to start going through the buildings and, you know, for lack of a better term, fighting like an ape. And he wins the second round. And the third round, Godzilla finally puts Kong down, as I kind of figured. Which is why a lot of the memes I was coming up with before the film came out were pro wrestling related. Like even the one, like, yeah, put Godzilla in the Scott Steiner thing. You know, they say all the Titans are created equal. But when you look at Kong and you look at me, see, that's not true. Now, normally when you fight another Titan, you got a 50-50 chance of winning. But when you put me and you put Kong in there, then you just go from there. But of course, Kong doesn't give up directly. So that whole thing about Kong bowing to no one makes sense. And of course, because Mechagodzilla being in there, the ending of the movie is them having to team up to face Mechagodzilla, which I know some fans are going to be disappointed at that, but I had no issue with that, because here's the reason. Now, for this film, Godzilla was still in his bad guy phase, which he would carry for another film fully, and then once Ghidorah came out, that's when he started his face turn. He was a bad guy for the first half, and then he turned face by the end. Kong is a full-on good guy here. I mean, in his first film, he's kind of like how Godzilla is in the first one. He's more neutral. He's just doing things that would be considered bad from the human perspective. like stepping on people, putting them in their mouth, chewing on them. But from his perspective, like, what are these people doing, trying to attack me and all that? In the second film is where he becomes a good guy, but that's his son. That would be his son. I believe it's Coco is what they called him, or Kiko or whatnot. Yeah, Kiko I think is what they called him. It's short for King Kong, so Kiko, his son. And of course, his popularity was still there, so it made sense for him to be the good guy. Here, they're kind of neutral, both of them, but they're, if you're looking at it from, like, say, the perspective of Ghidorah and all that, they both are technically good guys. So it's an Ultimate Warrior versus Hulk Hogan situation where they're both good guys. You can defy the fandom, and you're like, oh, we gotta figure out a way to do this. And of course, unlike that, where they just put one over, unless you're gonna count Godzilla winning the third part of their fight as him going over, you got to figure out another way to do it. And what's the old try and true situation of getting out of these ones? Either we got to go the old draw situation, which I know a lot of people are going to say this is a draw, but that is later revisionism. At the time this film came out, the makers of the film were very clear. That ending, Kong swimming away, no sign of Godzilla, they were clear. Kong won. And as they're the ones that made the film, I'm going with them on that one. If you want to say it's a draw, be my guest. At most, you would have to say it's a it's a decision by count out, so a double count out. Or if you want to use the wrestling thing, kicking too much butt and the referee called it. Which would make sense. I mean, they're just destroyed a bunch of real estate. Now, the other way to get out of having to give a winner is, of course, what they do here, and that is a third threat comes in and then they have to put aside their differences and fight. Now, I'm trying to mull through them, but the only one that really comes to mind that does something similar to that would be Alien vs. Predator. But that's mainly because the Predator teams up with the human character to fight the alien. Which I know some people that love the first two films are going to say, no, that's BS. However, that is an adaptation of what happens in the comic. Although from what I've read, it is done a lot better in the comic. But then the comic takes place in the future where we got space marines and colonies on other planets, whereas in that film is set in a contemporary setting. So for what they did, I was fine with it. Now there's probably some other examples in Versus films, but that's the first one that pops in my head like this. Now, in this case, the title character is teaming up to face an evil version of a Kiru-type Mechagodzilla powered by King Ghidorah makes sense, because he's the bigger threat. And them teaming up to go to school on him makes sense. It'd be like if in the middle of the Hulk Hogan Ultimate Warrior match, say, Andre the Giant interfered. Although I think he would have been a face by that point, so that's probably a bad example. Probably someone more like Hercules Hernandez or the whole Heenan family showed up and interfered in the match. I know that'd be an anticlimax for WrestleMania, but got to use the wrestling reference there. And of course, they destroy him. And of course, that whole thing is where I came up with my other meme for it. Disregard technology, embrace monkey. If anyone's wondering where that's from the Reject Humanity and Return to Monkey meme. And with how this film ends, it's nice to see that Kong has a happy ending. It's only the second film we've had with him, so it makes me wonder, is that it? We'll only have 2 films with him? Just 2 films with this version of Kong? I guess that would be the we would have the De Laurentiis duology, the Toho duology, and then now the legendary duology, and of course the RKO duology. But it's like, can we at least get a third film with him? I'd love to see another one like Kong, Hollow Earth, something like that, where he has to face another Titan threat from down below. Be a way to bring in Baragon or one of those other ones. Which, speaking of which, makes sense for Anguirus to live down there too. Or if they ever do a Destroy All Monsters, have Kong and a couple of the other ones show up on top. Of course, with how they brought in Ghidorah and Mechagodzilla, it's like it's kind of hard to do Destroy All Monsters now, because that was essentially their end game, was Destroy All Monsters. There. Of course, Godzilla's still up top. All in all, I did enjoy this film. Like I said, nice little throwback to the Showa era. Characters are written not super deep, but deep enough for this type of film. Special effects are pretty good. I did enjoy the fights and the special effects with it. Don't really have any major nitpicks other than, that whole little joke I made about, well, just don't book the match.
The rest of it made sense for me. I did like that Kong did not end up submitting and was still like you little punk, I'm still. Which, that's another thing there, is that you could say that Kong not submitting before his heart thing gives out, which is like, what is with Kong and his hearts? There's a Jeff Hardy reference in there too. You haven't beaten me, Zilla. I'm still standing. Hey, Zilla, I didn't hear no bell. Stuff like that. I know a couple of my friends are not the biggest fans of this film, which that's cool. Might have issue with a couple of their major nitpicks with it, but difference in opinion there. But I would be lying if I said I hated the film. Definitely plan on getting it once it hits Blu-ray. Speaking of Blu-rays, I believe I got my one for the De Laurentiis Kong film around here somewhere, so expect some more Kong-related videos to come down the